Well, the field of possible candidates for the next Liberal leader and Prime Minister is changing yet again. This is everyone we know of who's either running or still considering a leadership bid. Two ministers disappeared from the list over the weekend, with Anita, Anand and Stephen McKinnon both bowing out. But we've also got a new face on the board. Cape Breton MP Jaime Battiste is the first Mi'kmaq member of Parliament and now wants to be the first Indigenous Prime Minister. He says he's going to launch an exploratory team to see if he can meet the requirements to run. Liberal MP Jaime Battiste joins me now. Jaime Battiste, welcome to the show. It's good to see you.
Thank you for having me, Dave. Good to see you again.
You were not on any of the lists of suspected candidates for the party's top job. Why are you adding your name to this list now? What's the status of this?
To be totally honest, I wasn't on my own list. I was really hoping that individuals like Sean Fraser would put his hand up. I was hoping to see an Atlantic voice. One of the things I've been thinking about is, as I've been talking with some of the leadership hopefuls, is I haven't heard really about reconciliation, about the environment, about social justice as much as I would need to be comfortable supporting them at the moment. And I want to run a positive campaign, but to be honest, David, I was strongly urged to do this by First Nations leaders from across Canada. And the more conversations I had with folks, I said, this has never been done. It's a long shot at best. And they said, you don't know until you try. And so I really feel like I can be a voice for the Atlantic. I can be a voice for Indigenous people on the ballot. I'm one of the most vocal members of my caucus inside that caucus, as well as I've known people from Indigenous leaders from across Canada and have built a network through my days with the Assembly of First Nations. But also, talking to Indigenous leaders, I was talking to people like Wab Kinew, Premier Kinew, and I said, before there ever was a Premier Wab Kinew, there was a Elijah Harper. Before there ever was a President Barack Obama, there was a Jesse Jackson. Someone always has to be the first to try, even if the first steps they're taking is meant to help pave a road for the next generation. And so that's really what is inspiring me to do this.
It's going to take, though, a national profile. $350,000 is the cover charge to get into this race, and you still got to run a campaign beyond that. And you're obviously going to need a national network of fundraisers and organizers for this to be a credible launch. I mean, can you clear those bars?
Well, that's the first step. And I think that, I've been interested in hearing how you've been talking about candidates still considering it. What candidates are doing right now are spending every hour making calls. Basically, with a $350,000 threshold, you have to make $1,000 per hour in donations to reach that, because you can only put $25,000 of your own money into this. But I've been making calls across the country. I've got folks in Saskatchewan. I've got folks in Manitoba. I've got folks in Ontario that said they would make calls for me. And First Nations leaders are excited about this and saying, this has never been tried before. And so the first hurdle is to get to that 350,000 threshold. I've told folks that what I really want to do is reach out, do a social media campaign, because I can't afford to be on a plane all across Canada. Right. It has to be phone calls. And like I said, $1,000 per hour is the threshold. So what I've told people is that First Nations leaders have said, listen, if I can get 700 First Nations leaders, Atlantic people, to move forward and donate to my campaign. Sorry about this, but I hope that
that's a campaign momentum there, right? That's the people calling right now.
Manager, right. As a matter of fact.
Okay, all right. Well, but look, I want to ask you though. Like you're getting into this, when there are big names like Mark Carney, Chrystia Freeland, we expect will get in. Christy Clark has already indicated some things, but Jaime Battiste. I say this with no disrespect, because I'm a proud Atlantic Canadian as well. You're not a well-known national political figure. Your own riding, through the redistricting, has become less competitive for you. It's more challenging for you. I mean, how do you overcome those challenges to make a credible pitch to Liberals?
I think the first step is the financing and the fundraising and building a team. What I've announced so far is that I'm putting together an exploratory team from across the country in building that momentum. Quite frankly, you have to build momentum and you have to build a network across the country. Luckily, I've been doing this as a First Nations youth leader since I was 22 years old, and I've gone from being an AFN youth chair to a regional chief to a MP. This is something that I believe I have the networks across Canada, but you're right, David, that this is going to be a tough one when you have really powerful names on there. But if anything we've witnessed in democracy, it's not always the most powerful or well-known person who gets the overall bid in these races. Sometimes it can be a long shot. Sometimes it can be someone who wasn't a front runner. I think being a front runner is probably in races like this might be the worst place you can be in. But I think that if I can get Indigenous people excited about this, if I can get First Nations youth excited about the first ever Indigenous person to throw his name in the ring, that's really something that I really hope to do is create that excitement across this country. And I don't believe that excitement exists today. And I need to be a different kind of candidate. Someone who is a law background, but someone also who's been a musician, someone who's been a professor, someone who's, I think that someone you want to sit down and have a beer with at the end of the day. And I think that's also a part of this.
Well, Jaime Battiste, you've highlighted two things, your Atlantic roots and your Indigenous heritage, your Mi'kmaq, right, for people who don't know. I have a question, though. Like, you've had to retract a couple of comments that upset people in Atlantic Canada and upset Indigenous people, right? Like, you recently talked about the EI culture of Atlantic Canada. I believe it was at the recent caucus meeting where you had to choke that back. And then in the 2019 campaign, some of your past tweets about Indigenous women were brought up, and you had to apologize for those. I mean, people are going to research it and Google you if they're going to get on board, and these are some of the things they're going to find. I mean, what do you say to people who say this is disqualifying?
Well, I think that, I don't want to be defined by my past. I want to learn from it. And, the things that I said in tweets when I was a different person in a different part of my life is not the leader that I've been today. When those things were going on, I called a person like Wab Kinew, who was an MLA at the time, and I said, what do you think I should do? And he said, you get a chance to show them who you really are. And I think over the past 5 years, I've got to show people who I really am. And as for the Atlantic comment around EI, like if you look at that interview, they were asking me about what are the issues that people were talking to me about. And the people who were talking to me about fisheries and EI, and they took a quote that was a throwaway quote, but if you look at the interview, that was actually happening. And David, just not to make excuses, but if you've ever woke up at 3:30 a.m., flown from Sydney, Nova Scotia, all the way to Nanaimo, BC, and then had a media scrum as soon as you get in, I think the whole interview as a whole was a lot better than the throwaway line that they tried to pin on me.
Well, I mean, that kind of travel and that kind of schedule would be a thing were you to win. I mean, the tweet was, why do I assume every skinny Aboriginal girl is on crystal meth or pills? But it should say you were much younger and you've apologized for that, but that is still there, right?
Also, let's get it close. That was, it said watching APTN. It was a show on APTN. So, but you know what? I've done a lot to ensure that I've shown that I'll be a leader and a champion for Indigenous women. I'm really proud of that Nova Scotia is the first region in Canada to have an Indigenous Women's Resilience Centre. And I worked hard with the Nova Scotia Native Women's Association to ensure that that happened. It was a $9 million announcement, and it was one of the most proudest moments of my life. And some of the strongest people who are right now backing me are Indigenous women. They're my campaign manager. They're my team that's out there supporting me. And so I think I've shown over the past 5 years that, who I am as opposed to who the Conservatives tried to frame me to be. Okay,
we're out of time, but just a quick question. You say an exploratory committee. When do we know if you're in this or not? I mean, you've got to make a decision, end of this week at the latest?
I don't think anyone can make a firm decision until they know the rules.
Well, the rules are out. I mean, you need $350,000, 300 signatures, and all these sorts of things. I mean, you'll know pretty quickly whether you can raise $1,000 an hour, won't you?
I think that I'll know by January 24th if this is a possibility. But over the weekend, I made 60 calls to Indigenous leaders across Canada, and I've got commitments of over 40,000 without even making this public. And so it was just all done by phone calls, and I'll continue those phone calls, and I'll continue to work hard to take on this monumental challenge to be the first ever Indigenous person to run for Prime Minister.
Jaime Battiste, thanks for coming on. We appreciate it, and let us know when you make a final call. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you.